like a software version that you can run on your own computer as opposed to the one for the lecture theatres. I think the one for the lecture theatres you just don't have the option.
No, the consoles never do anything. They had to. The way they did it is they log on to Echo 360 itself, and they have like an in-browser overlay where you can press start, stop, and all the good stuff.
Oh, okay.
And you can't.
Oh my gosh, there is. Hello.
Yeah, there's like start, stop, and a whole bunch of other stuff.
My goodness. Why is it so hard to... Where was this console hiding? Like it gave me a pop-up to view the console. Wow, okay. Alright, back to the question. Alright, so we have timing ticks, so a timer goes off 10 times a second. The timer is really important for a system like this because you get like a question like this that says, 10 seconds has elapsed. In an event-driven system, you can't just be all like, let's wait 10 seconds. Waiting 10 seconds is not an event. Albeit in a lot of the software systems that we design, there is like some sort of mechanism to say, you know, do something in 10 seconds time. But in an embedded system, which like that's effectively what we're looking at here. We're looking at an embedded system where we just have some really basic events that we can work with. So we have the tick, we have lock and unlock. We cannot assume that we actually have a mechanism in place for us to explicitly say, okay, wait 10 seconds and then do this. So we have to implement that manually ourselves using the source of the timing event. And that means that if we want to wait for 10 seconds and we have an event that is triggered 10 times a second, we need a way of saying, okay, well, if the event goes 10 times a second, we want to wait for 10 seconds, we need to wait for 100 of these events to have occurred. And once 100 of these events have occurred, then we're like, cool, that's been 10 seconds. So that's where the tick, timer tick comes in. And if you look at some of the other examples and examples in the book, that's what's going on with that. So, okay, so we have the door starts in the lock position when the user presses the unlock button. We have a light that flashes, so we have an output that is a light, which is that. We also have the car's lock, the driver's door, and all of the other doors. So presumably we have the ability to lock and unlock each door, or we could just say, for argument's sake, because the question doesn't tell us explicitly the difference between the doors, but it does explicitly say we have the driver's door and we have all of the doors, so we can assume that we have some way to explicitly trigger just the driver's door or to explicitly trigger all of the doors in the system. So we can just create a function, or we can pretend or assume that there is a function like unlock driver door, and that we can just trigger when we want to do stuff. Or versus unlock all doors. Okay, so if the unlock button is pressed again before 10 seconds has elapsed, pressing the lock button. Okay, so we've been told about holding the lock button down for 5 seconds. So we have to assume that there is a release action as well as a press action. Otherwise, there's no way to detect if the button has been pressed down for 5 seconds. One could potentially argue that the press event would be constantly firing all the way through, but for an event-driven system like this, we would assume that a single press down of the button would be a single discrete event and that it wouldn't be triggered multiple times. But maybe we also have... Yeah.
Where if it didn't have that case, then you could argue that holding the button down, you wouldn't need a release condition.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, being familiar with this question in particular, I know that we're expecting there to be the presence of a release action as well as a press action. I am not going to be this unclear or ambiguous in the actual exam that you sit. But for the sake of answering this question, let's take a look at this. So, all right, so we have. Sorry. What's that? I brought paper with. Okay, so to reiterate, we have two buttons and a timer. So we have a tick event. We have a Okay, so tick event, we have the lock button being pressed, the lock button being released, the unlock button being pressed, and the unlock button being released. Release. So we have 5 event sources in the system that can trigger our transitions, and then we have 3 outputs, I think. We have the LED, which we can blink some number of times. Now, for the sake of a question like this, we can assume that we can specify how many times we want the LED to blink. We do not have to implement the manual timing to force the LED to flash 3 times and jump through states as we manually flash the LED. Arguably, that has to be in the program's control logic somewhere, but for us, or maybe it's like we have the flash once function and we call the flash once function 3 times. Or something like that. Actually, in fact, that's probably a better way to do it. I'm just going to put that in. It's a clearer way to do it. So we have an LED function that flashes the LED once. We call it 3 times to flash it 3 times. That makes sense. And then we have driver. Now, do we actually need explicitly driver lock, or do we need...
Just driver unlock.
Yeah, so we need driver unlock, all unlock, and then lock to lock everything. So those are our 4 outputs. These are our 5 inputs. Let's draw the system. So now this question is open. It just lets us do whatever, which is arguably a good or a bad thing, because because a merely more machine is clearly the best way to do this, but past exams for this course have explicitly specified which one you want the system to, or which type of system you want they want you to draw. So there is a good chance that you will be explicitly told draw a more diagram, or draw a merely diagram, or draw a merely more diagram, and you need to draw the right one. So this question happens to say choose what you think is most appropriate. It's possibly because also the system is so convoluted and complex that they've gone, you know what, choose whatever's appropriate to do this, because this is really complicated. And you can see that they've given a bunch of extra marks here to breaking down for you to just talk about why you've implemented things a certain way. So that's effectively free marks if you're making reasonable arguments, and we've gone through a bunch of those already. So we're pretty good there. Issues with the timing system, all that stuff. So, right, where do we start? What type of diagram do we want to draw?
Which one do you think is the most difficult? I think neither one's the best, but...
I think, in terms of which type of diagram is most difficult, I don't necessarily think any is more difficult than the other. I think some of them are more time consuming than others, but it also depends on the type of system that you're designing. Um, so a Mealy-Moore machine will give you the most succinct answer in pretty much every case because
That's kind of just how it works.
yeah, exactly. It takes all the good features of a Mealy machine, it takes all the good features of a Moore machine and combines them together into a single thing. So you don't need to like repeat behavior across the system, which is nice. Okay, let's do a Moore machine. We're not going to have time to do the whole thing, but we'll, make as much reasonable progress as we can. I'm going to need more space. I should have brought bigger paper. That's all good. We'll see what we can do. I'll just write small and zoom in. Okay, so the system initializes, and what does the system do when it initializes?
It's in locked position.
It's in the lock position, and no, it just starts in the locked position. It doesn't say if the red light flashes or anything when the system is initialized. I'm just going to roll with maybe it does to simplify things. So let's say that we have a locked state like so. System initializes into that. I should really switch to the black pen, that's fine. So what happens when the car's door gets locked? So we call the lock function and we blink the LED once, and that's our functionality. So the system starts here. What are our options? So we want to work through all of the possible things that we can do at any given step. So we want to draw out for each of these events what the system does, and if there is like ambiguities about the behavior, for example, like, oh well, you press the lock button but it's only been 3 seconds versus you press the lock but it's been 5 seconds, we might have to add some like conditional logic into them, in which case you need to have a version of the lock press event that occurs before 5 seconds versus a version that occurs after 5 seconds. Make sure that you actually cover the exactly 5 seconds case as well. You don't want to ever end up with any undefined behavior in a system like this. Otherwise, stuff breaks and you end up with your Patriot missile getting like out of sync over a period of 10 days and then it can't shoot down the incoming missile. True story, that's a thing that happened. Their timing signal was out by like 1 tick and it slowly got out of sync over like the course of a month. Alright, anyway. Okay, what do we want to start with? Okay, so we're in the lock position and the lock button has been pressed down. Now, what happens when the lock button is pressed down? The description says
5-second tick.
yeah, we want to start this whole 5-second thing, don't we? So we're going to need to put ourselves into a state where we're like, oh, let's wait to see if it's been 5 seconds yet. So I'm going to create a state called hold. And now, on entry into this state, what do we need to do? We probably need to reset the time that we're waiting. So any time that the lock button gets pressed, we're going to reset this counter that we're keeping track of. So I'm going to say counter equals 0. And so anytime we enter into the holding state from somewhere else, we're going to start this counter. Let's take a look at the other events that we have. We have the lock button being released while we're in the locked state. Yeah, so the question is like, you might want to ask yourself first, how do we actually get here? But we also need to like account for it explicitly, regardless of how we got here. But an example of how we got here is if we release the lock button. No, I don't think it's actually possible, but let's account for it anyway, just for good measure. Now, because we don't want anything to happen, we actually need to create another state. Because if we explicitly go, all right, I'll stay here, staying here in a more machine requires us to exit the state and re-enter the state, which re-triggers the entry conditions. So this would be lock up. I'm just going to call it L2, which is a state that represents being locked, but we're not doing anything whenever we enter it. One could potentially argue that the entry condition arrives here. All right, we have that's the lock button being released, unlock being pressed down. That's going to unlock the driver's door only. Okay, it's going to unlock the driver's door, and explicitly it's going to blink the LED twice and unlock the driver's door. So driver unlock and LED, flash the LED twice. Okay, 1, 2, 3. And if we are in the locked state and the timer goes off, what do you want to do? Or if there's a timer tick when we're in the locked state?
Nothing.
Yeah, so that's going to put us into this L2 state, because we don't want the doors to relock themselves 10 times a second. Just like imagine your car, like you press the button on your car's remote and suddenly like the doors start locking themselves and like the lights on the cars are like flashing 10 times a second. Yeah, we don't want that to happen, so the empty state again. So in the worst case scenario, you potentially end up with every single state being mirrored. You have like the state that contains all of the entry behavior and then a copy of that state that has all of the same outbound transitions as its main state, but also it has no behavior associated with it. It doesn't do anything when you enter that state, and its sole purpose exists just to handle cases where you would normally stay in that existing state. Obviously a deficiency of Moore's model, but Moore's model does have the niceness that if you were to translate one of your like very basic FSAs from like chapter 1 into a basic system with like some behavior associated with it, you would probably end up doing a Moore's model, because a Moore machine can be translated absolutely 100% directly out of the transition table for a standard FSA, because the behavior is associated with the state, so it translates one-to-one, which is really nice. Okay, that's that. 1, 2, 3, 4. What am I missing? Oh, unlock button being released. Again, nothing happening there. And it's like, okay, well, how could we ever have a case of the unlock button being released while we're already in the locked state? It could be that you've like mashed both buttons simultaneously, and like you pressed the lock one first and then sort of mashed over to the unlock one. No, sorry, the other way around. Yeah, you press the unlock one and then you like mash the lock button, so that's relocked the car, and then afterwards you've lifted off of the unlock button, so